The Black Rose McQueen. I wanted to give a shout out to Ring IQ Boxing, and remember to tune in to the motherfucking relay.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Will Team Pulev aim for contingency plan to stage Joshua fight? I know Joshua's promoter, Eddie Hearn, has questioned Dana White's plans to promote UFC events now during this pandemic, said Gotsev, CEO of Epic Sports. But throughout the last 100 years, boxing has been a refuge from some of the biggest challenges our world has ever seen. Throughout the Great Depression, 2 world wars, even the tragedy of September 11th, boxing has been first to capture the hearts, minds, and the imagination of the public when they needed it most. Therefore, Joshua versus Pulev must go on. Safety is our #1 priority, but it's now time to separate the boys from the men. The show must go on. We cannot let fear stand in the way of our very existence. A 15-minute rapid test is now readily available, and soon antibody testing and certification will exist. While it is clearly not practical to test 70,000 fans coming into a stadium, testing the 100 or so persons required for the first-class television production of a World Heavyweight Championship fight with no live audience is now well within the realm of possibility. The truth is that soccer is still being played in stadiums in Europe. The WWE had a pay-per-view event last week in the United States. The German Soccer League announced today their plans to start playing soccer soon, and Major League Baseball has discussed plans to hold a modified season in Arizona, said Wirt, president of Epic Sports. People need entertainment, and sports specifically. While being cooped up inside for this long, you can catch a fever from COVID-19, but you can also get a bad case of cabin fever.
What?
If you don't take care of your mental health. Just like Netflix, sports is an essential service because we need to keep people from worrying themselves sick over this virus. Pulev, for his part, said he was ready to make the fight anywhere. As I have said repeatedly, I'm ready to battle, anytime and any place, said the mandatory challenger Pulev. So come on AJ, let's make this historic fight happen for the world and give our fans a battle they will never forget. You know, it's easy to sit there being all gung-ho about how the fight should go on without actually having a plan as to how the fight would go on. Where would the fight go on? You understand? Because this is a global pandemic. This is affecting all corners of the world. And as far as the British Boxing Board of Control is concerned, there's not going to be no closed-door cards before the lockdown is lifted.
Somebody want to tell Pulev?
Robert Smith, General Secretary of the British Boxing Board of Control, is making it clear that there will be no boxing behind closed doors before the coronavirus lockdown is lifted. That is not going to happen before the lockdown is officially lifted, says Smith. There is no way we will sanction boxing under the lockdown, nor is it even possible while social distancing is in place. Not even in television studios, Smith tells Daily Mail. The well-being of all those involved is paramount. In our case, it is impossible to maintain social distancing between 2 boxers. No fighter can hit another from a range of 2 meters. And what about the closeness of the referee, the contact between fighters and their corners, the proximity of officials and cameramen? Other medical issues are in some ways even more important. Even if we could persuade the doctors and medics who it is necessary for us to have at ringside at all promotions to attend, how on earth could we justify asking them to take time away from saving lives during this crisis? Injuries happen in sports all the time. What if a boxer is badly hurt and needing to go by ambulance to the hospital? I tell you this, it is absolutely unconscionable that we would even consider asking any hospital to give up a bed while thousands of people are dying from this virus. People in boxing are experiencing hardship. Of course there is immediate loss of earnings for some, but also few smaller promoters may go under if this crisis lasts too long. There is criticism of big promoters, but while they are well funded now, when they come to lose money, they do so in much larger amounts. But health has to come first. Boxing will not resume the day after government lifts its lockdown. We cannot run the risk of being rushed until all medical and policing precautions can be put into place. Look, I'd love for boxing to be on television right now just as much as the next fucking guy. I really would.
Seriously.
But the reality of it is that you cannot justify the expenditure of resources at this time on the premise of preventing cabin fever?
What?
I mean, what kind of drugs is Word on? To my recollection, I've never heard of anybody dying as a result of cabin fever. I haven't heard of anybody asphyxiating as a result of cabin fever. But what I have been hearing is that there are people on ventilators right now around the world struggling to breathe in induced comas where machines are breathing for them as a result of this virus. That is the gravity of the situation, and the very idea that the people over there at Epic want to move ahead with this thing in light of what the BBOC is saying, in light of Anthony Yard.
Did you hear about him?
Anthony Yard has lost both his father and his grandmother as a result of this virus, as a result of this pandemic. Anthony Yard himself took to social media urging people to stay inside, practice social distancing, as this is not a game. And the severity of this situation takes precedence over all day-to-day functions, including boxing. I mean, what are you trying to convince people of exactly? That a case of cabin fever is worse than a case of COVID-19?
Huh?
Is that what you're trying to do?
Huh?
Well, excuse the fuck out of me, Dr. Pepper, right? I don't think anyone could decide to move forward in good conscience to stage any kind of an event at this time. Not in good conscience, you understand. Can you imagine what the implications would be if said staff member during said boxing match afterwards ended up testing positive for COVID-19? Could you imagine how the situation would worsen for all the involved parties if said staff member were to end up
In a fucking hospital?
become symptomatic, exhibiting symptoms of COVID-19, subsequently has to be hospitalized and put into a medically induced coma, is placed on a ventilator, loses lung function, and subsequently dies after having worked as a staff member for a boxing match that really shouldn't have been taking place in the first place? I mean, could you imagine how poorly that would reflect for all the involved parties who decided to go ahead with this thing? Do you realize that even one death,
Just one.
in this situation would be one death too many, as governments around the world are all pretty much saying the same thing? Exercise social distancing. Stay inside. Don't even go to the market for knickknacks. Only go to the market for the essentials, if you must, if you insist, as that is the gravity of the situation. And the people over there at Epic think cabin fever.
Okay.
Cabin fever.
You're high.
Is reason enough to throw caution to the wind and stage an event that at minimum would require at least 100 people to be there to work the event.
Yeah.
Well, it's a skeleton crew, yes.
Yes.
A skeleton crew of 100 staff members could easily result in a skeleton crew of 100 infected staff members, as this is a highly communicable virus.
I take it that the people over there at Epic must be reading those reports that are coming from out of China. Where currently, things are slowly returning back to normal. Certain governmental provisions have been lifted. Public gathering spaces are being filled up and occupied. The Chinese are coming out in droves, at least based on what the reports are saying. However, there are those out there who are skeptical of these reports, as there is a feeling that the Chinese were not completely transparent with the initial outbreak, that certain information was suppressed, was withheld, and had it not been suppressed, perhaps we could have got ahead of this thing, we could have got a better fix on this thing, and it wouldn't have gotten as far as it did. But better still, there are reports out now that things are returning to normal for the Chinese. In South Korea, who has had a better fix on the situation, containing it more so than many other countries like Italy, like Spain, like the United States, their day-to-day lives were not as affected by the pandemic as some other countries that are out there. Perhaps these sites are appealing sites to the people over there at Epic. They're thinking to themselves, you know what? Maybe we don't stage this thing in the UK. Maybe we stage it somewhere else in the wild. The people that want to watch it are likely going to watch it via DAZN.
And Sky.
And we can make our money that way. But I think, even in a situation like that, what's not being factored in is that
Unemployment.
the people that you intend to market this fight to sell this fight to,
Are broke.
the people who are subscribed to DAZN and the pay-per-view audience over there in the UK that will in all likelihood still be at home, thus they will have to purchase the fight as a Sky Sports pay-per-view. Those people may not have the disposable income right now to fritter away on a boxing match. Obviously, the live gate for a Pulev versus Joshua fight would be so affected if you decide to move forward with it now, because you're talking about staging it without an audience. And the goal would have to be to make the money that you want to make from the people at home, the people watching the fight at home. But what you're not factoring in is that the people at home may not have disposable income right now to spend on a pay-per-view event, as there are many displaced employees without jobs right now, without jobs to go to. Thus, whatever money they've got left, they can't afford to spend it on a boxing match. If we were talking about some other kind of card involving some other kind of fighters, smaller names that don't require as much compensation for their participation. If we were talking about a couple of flyweights or something like that, maybe you could pull it off. But we're talking about Anthony Joshua, we're talking about Kubrat Pulev, we're talking about the heavyweight division, and we know what kind of dollar amounts are normally associated with these kinds of fights. Thus, staging one
Impractical.
right now would be highly impractical. I mean, when Epic talks about getting the wheels in motion to see this fight come off, what kind of timeline are we looking at?
Beats me.
I reiterate, I'd love for boxing to come back sooner than later, just as much as anybody else. But we've got to be realistic here. We've got to be realistic as far as what it would take and what we're dealing with, and how soon can we expect to come out of it. As Dr. Fauci himself, guy who we've all come to know and love, he stated quite plainly, it's the virus that sets the timeline, not anybody else. And the virus is what's got to get its foot off the gas before we can. All we can do right now is hang in there and take caution and adhere to what provisions are in place. I think the people at Epic, they didn't get the memo.
Nope.
Once the curve is finally blunted, perhaps we will see a resurgence of cards in boxing, but we're talking about smaller cards with smaller names. This is a high-profile fight, and I don't imagine that this is going to be one of the very first fights we see once boxing resumes. Just being realistic. In super middleweight news, Callum Smith had this to say. He says, I have no Canelo regrets. He was quoted as saying, it's frustrating, all this happening, but we're all in the same position, all in the same boat, and we've just got to keep ticking over and staying ready for when we do get the green light to go again. I think there will be a lot of shows, back to back, so us as fighters have got to just stay ready for one of them. I didn't get the fight, but I've got no regrets about it. Smith continued when talking about Alvarez. I did everything I could to get it, and even lowered my number. But right now, I'll fight any of the other three champions if I don't get a Canelo fight. The three of them are probably as good as each other. They're all good fighters who are in good fights, and they're all world champions. It was revealed back in December that Smith was next in line for David Benavidez, the WBC champion, had he got past Avni Yildirim. Now that's a very interesting angle of this story, that via the WBC, Callum Smith was in line for a David Benavidez unification match. If you're wondering how that breaks down, if you're wondering how could Callum Smith, a reigning full-fledged world champion holding both the Ring Magazine and WBA titles, if you're wondering how is it that a champion is in line for another champion when champions don't normally get ranked by the alphabets, well, it's simple. Along with those two other belts, the Ring Magazine and the WBA title, Callum Smith also holds a lesser version of the WBC title, the Diamond Belt, and that Diamond Belt is used as a segue to stage fights, between champions. It's not the first time I've seen this, wouldn't have been the first time as it hasn't come to pass, but when it comes to that Diamond Belt, Jorge Linares used to hold the Diamond Belt, and Mikey Garcia held the full-fledged title, the world title, And I remember that the WBC tried to hit the gas on that fight. That fight never materialized, as we all know, in spite of the WBC's order, mandate, or whatever it was. And neither of the two parties faced any consequences as a result of the fight not happening. Nobody was stripped of anything. So in light of that, and in light of this, I have no doubts that it would have been a similar situation to where even if the WBC so decided to get involved, the fight still wouldn't have happened. The fight would still not have materialized in spite of the WBC's involvement, as neither of the aforementioned parties would be under threat of losing anything. It's an interesting angle, but not that interesting. Better still, Callum Smith appears to have Canelo on his mind, still have Canelo on his mind. And he says that he has no regrets, but the fact that he's still talking about him, well, that suggests otherwise. And Callum is just one of many fighters who we often talk about waiting to hit the Canelo Alvarez sweepstakes. And this is a very scratch and sniff approach to building your marquee value, building up your name. Look, you've got to give that guy a reason to even look in your direction, because if you don't, the decision to go ahead with a fight solely rests on him.
Yeah.
As he is the only marquee fighter involved.
Yeah.
You know, there's a reason you don't see those mega matchups on the same scale as you used to see them, the scale of a Oscar De La Hoya versus Felix Trinidad, for example. In that situation, what you had was two very good fighters, undefeated fighters, coming together to make a super fight. It wasn't all just on one guy. Both guys brought a rather large set of fans to the table, and because you have two different sets of fans and two different high-profile fighters, that creates the environment for the mega fight. Whereas a lot of these guys in this day and age, they're not bringing that to the table, and you're not helping your situation by turning your nose up at every other fight that isn't a Canelo fight, because those are the fights that are going to add value to your name. Those are the fights that are going to raise your profile. But if what you do is sit on your hands playing it safe up until Canelo picks you, you're not helping your situation, because what if he doesn't pick you? What if he picks someone else? As you are indistinguishable from anyone else. You're just one guy in a pool of guys, one option in a pool of options. It's for this reason that you don't see those same kind of mega matchups that you used to see before. That, yeah, Oscar had fans, he had buckets upon buckets of fans, but so did Felix. You put them together, you get a mega match. If you're Callum Smith, you know, when Callum Smith saw that Billy Joe Saunders was crossing over to the matchroom side of things, he should have been chomping at the bit to get that fight. But Callum seemed uninterested and quite complacent, whereas if he had done everything he could to get the fight, pursue it, get Billy in the ring, beat Billy, take his belt, that's one less guy for you to have to compete with. That's one less guy that Canelo Alvarez might so decide to pass you over for. You take the guy out of the equation. You don't just establish yourself as an authority at the weight to appease the fans. I mean, that's not the only virtue of that. The other virtue is, if you take out the competition, a guy like Canelo rolls around, he decides to campaign in your weight class, there's that much pressure on him to deal with you as opposed to somebody else. If you go about things the way that Callum went about things, well, you end up like Callum. You end up getting passed over, because you're the one leaving Canelo with that many more options to pass you over for.